The sun rises. The weak light of the morning brightens the vast space of John F. Kennedy International Airport. A new day begins, just like any other day in New York. But for James Carter, today is not just another ordinary day. This is a trip he has planned for a long time, but not just for relaxation. This is his final flight, the flight that he hopes will change his life. James is a 28-year-old black man, tall with dark skin and deep eyes, looking as if they hold a story he never tells. Despite being a talented aerospace engineer, James's work and life are always tied to discrimination. He has lived and worked in an industry where people like him, black individuals, make up a very small percentage. Every day he faces indifference and even disdain from many colleagues who are still not used to the idea of a black person succeeding in this field. The Pacific Skies Flight 204 that James is about to board is not an easy journey. Although the purpose of the trip is to relax, James cannot detach from his deep thoughts about his job, the challenges in his career, and the stresses he has faced since entering the aviation industry. Despite being an experienced aerospace engineer, every time he enters a meeting room with predominantly white colleagues, he always feels like an outsider. The condescending looks, the quiet side conversations, and the lack of respect seem to be a part of the job he cannot avoid. This is not the first time James has felt alone in a crowd. Whenever he attends a technical meeting, he finds that his contributions are not valued appropriately. The ideas he proposes are often overlooked, not because of a lack of creativity, but simply because he is a black man in an environment full of subtle prejudices. Nevertheless, James is not one to give up easily. He has always believed in his abilities and knows that one day his talents will be recognized. This flight is an opportunity for him to relax, to temporarily distance himself from the work stress, and to find peace in his mind. But as he sits on the plane, thoughts about his job continue to swirl in his head. Will this trip really help me find a new path? James wonders as he looks out the airplane window. He has been thinking about what he will do if nothing changes. He could continue being an engineer, but would this job still bring him joy, satisfaction? Or will there be another path, another career that he can pursue? But for now, with these thoughts, James only knows that he needs rest. He needs time to recharge, to find a new direction for his life. The atmosphere in the plane is peaceful. The whispers of the passengers around him are like gentle waves lapping against the shore, occasionally drowned out by the smooth hum of the plane's engine as it soars into the sky. James feels a rare sense of comfort, something he hasn't experienced much lately. He takes a deep breath, letting the worries temporarily fade away, trying to relax his body and mind. Looking out the window, the sunlight reflects off the white clouds, a color he has always loved. The clouds drift by, like the burdens in his heart, slowly fading away. James thinks about his mother, the woman he deeply respects and loves. His mother was a strong woman, raising him through trials and difficulties. She was always the one encouraging him when life's challenges became overwhelming. His mother taught him that, despite life's injustices, as long as he doesn't give up, he will find his path. And James always believed that his mother was the only one who saw his true potential, even though the outside world sometimes didn't see him that way. A soft announcement comes over the plane's PA system. It's the captain, who is flying Pacific Skies Flight 204. We are flying smoothly and will be arriving in Honolulu in about 5 hours. The weather along the way is beautiful and there is nothing to worry about. Please relax and enjoy the flight. As an aerospace engineer, James still feels a bit excited when he hears such announcements. Every flight, even though it has become a daily routine, still sparks a deep passion in him. He has spent his life learning about airplanes, their flight mechanics, and their operations. Airplanes, although not human, have a soul to James. And in these moments, as he looks out at the vast sky, he feels free, able to soar high and freely think about everything. But like so many times in his life, the joy is only temporary. The feeling of freedom is always suppressed by unspoken questions, by conflicting emotions that James cannot escape from. What can I do to change this life? James wonders again. This question has no answer, but he knows that only action will help him find an answer. And then, as the plane starts to stabilize in the air, the light from the window hits his face, and James realizes that this flight is not just a vacation. It's an opportunity for him to reflect on himself, to face the questions he has been avoiding all this time. In this journey, even though he doesn't know what awaits ahead, James Carter senses that this is the moment he begins a new journey. A journey not just in the sky, but also in his own soul. Pacific Skies Flight 204 took off from John F. Kennedy International Airport on a clear morning. James Carter felt an indescribable relief as he watched the clouds fade beneath him. The plane slowly ascended, passing through thick layers of clouds, opening up a vast and peaceful space ahead. This was the moment James had been waiting for, a moment when all the worries about work, family, and life's challenges could be set aside. The passengers around him began to find comfortable spots, curling up with books or pillows. The sound of light laughter echoed, mostly from groups of friends on vacation, happy couples, and families enjoying their summer break. But for James, this was not just a typical holiday. It was an opportunity to shake off the constraints of his chaotic life and begin an inward journey. He loosened his tie, unbuckled his coat, and leaned back in his seat, allowing his body to relax with the steady rhythm of the plane. Every day, his job at the airline never stopped. Each flight, every day spent working in a cold, formulaic environment. James felt the invisible gap growing between him and his colleagues. But when the plane took off, this vast space allowed him to forget everything. All he had to do was look out the window and let his thoughts drift away with the wind. However, in that moment, an undeniable truth surfaced in his mind. James felt uneasy. He was living in a society where opportunities did not always come easily for people like him. Times when he tried to elevate his knowledge, propose creative ideas at work, were sometimes dismissed just because he was black. He had to work twice as hard as others, not only to prove his ability, but also to prove that he deserved to be in a world that often excluded people like him. Will I ever find a place where I don't have to prove myself every day? James wondered inside, his eyes still fixed on the vast sky. Although there were still many concerns in his heart, he could not deny the sense of freedom he felt while sitting on this flight. The flight to Honolulu was a chance for him to recharge. He needed time to breathe, to inhale the fresh air of the sea, to relax and stop thinking about the biases at work, to stop thinking about the skeptical glances. Perhaps a long vacation is exactly what I need, he thought, closing his eyes and letting the steady hum of the plane lull him into a short sleep. However, the sleep didn't last long. A sudden commotion from the back of the cabin jolted James awake. The laughter and chatter from the passengers around him had stopped, replaced by a tense atmosphere. Some people were trying to find their belongings or anxiously looking out the window. The unease from the back of the cabin made James feel slightly worried. He looked out the window, still seeing the vast blue sky, but the winds from the distant thick clouds were moving closer. The captain quickly made an announcement over the intercom. Dear passengers, we are flying through an area with unfavorable weather conditions. We will need to change course to avoid a small storm ahead. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. The announcement made everyone more alert, but James felt that this was just a routine issue that planes often encounter. This small storm would pass, and everything would be fine. But there was something strange in the air. James looked around and noticed that the passengers seemed more tense than usual. A couple sitting ahead of him exchanged worried glances, and a group of friends was whispering to each other, but none of them seemed truly at ease. Passengers around him began to grow anxious. their eyes fixed on the flight crew, seeking reassurance from the flight attendants. James turned back to his thoughts. He began reflecting on his work and life. Could he ever find a place where he didn't have to face the disdainful glances of others, where he could work freely without carrying the weight of discrimination? Could he start over, look for another opportunity, or would he have to continue fighting for acceptance in a world full of prejudice? The flight continued, but James felt more tense as time passed. A strange feeling of unease began to creep into his heart. Although he was someone who always tried to keep calm in any situation, today that feeling wouldn't leave him. The images of his work, unnamed events, the puzzled looks from colleagues, all these things felt like a faint cloud surrounding him. Still, a part of James remained optimistic, still hoping that this flight would give him a chance to see life from a new perspective, a perspective he had never considered before. He believed that no matter what, all the hardships in life could be overcome as long as he persisted. Because life, with all its challenges, is the place where he can prove himself. And this flight might be the beginning of a major change. A bell rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. He looked out the window, and the drifting clouds slowly parted, making way for a vast, open sky. The air seemed lighter, and he knew that, even though this flight might face turbulence, in the end, the clouds would disperse and the sunlight would shine again. The flight continued smoothly in the first few minutes. James sat quietly, letting himself relax as the plane began to conquer the fluffy white clouds under the sunlight. Although he tried to relax, his mind could not escape the endless thoughts about his work and life. He still worried about unresolved issues, unanswered challenges in his career. But at least in this moment, he could look up at the sky, forgetting the burdens of life. An hour passed, and the atmosphere in the cabin began to calm. The passengers started to unwind, some drifting off to sleep, others laughing and chatting with each other. The cabin returned to a tranquil state, only the gentle hum of the engine and the quiet murmurs of conversation. However, that peace did not last long. A dry, sharp noise rang out, causing the whole cabin to shake violently. The feeling of being thrust into his seat made James jolt. It wasn't just a normal vibration. It was a strong, violent shock. Panic-stricken screams began to echo from the rear of the cabin, mixing with the torn atmosphere from the sudden emergency. Passengers started sitting up straight, their eyes glued to the flight crew, looking worried. James tensed, instinctively gripping his seat. He immediately knew that this flight was facing a serious problem. Although the situation was unclear, he had worked in the aviation industry long enough to recognize that something very unusual was happening. The plane continued to shake more and more intensely. The sighs and panicked whispers of the passengers made the atmosphere even more tense. Some people began to pray, while others simply hugged each other tightly. The air became suffocating. The feeling of fear was inevitable, and James's initial calm seemed to begin to waver. His eyes scanned the cabin, searching for support from the flight attendants, but they stood silently, doing nothing but maintaining their positions to stabilize the situation. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but this time there was no certainty as before. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are experiencing an emergency with the aircraft's engine. We will adjust our flight path to ensure safety. Please fasten your seat belts and return to your seats." The captain's words did not bring reassurance. A wave of indescribable worry rose within James. He turned to look out the window. The sky outside was no longer as clear as before. Dark clouds had suddenly gathered, covering the entire space, swirling in motion. The storm was no longer just a weather condition he could ignore. He felt the power of the approaching storm, and he knew that it was a real threat. The plane began to shake even harder, at times tilting to one side, causing screams to rise throughout the cabin. The passengers around him were panicking, some unable to maintain their composure and beginning to cry. James felt the fear spreading throughout the cabin, as if everyone had lost hope. They didn't know what was happening, and they certainly didn't know whether they could survive the storm. I can't just sit here and wait, James thought. I have to do something. He immediately stood up, no longer thinking about whether he could be safe or not. A sense of responsibility began to rise within him. Although he had never faced a situation like this, as an aerospace engineer, James knew that every moment now was extremely critical. He needed to get to the cockpit to assess the situation, to see what he could do to save the plane. As he moved toward the cockpit, the flight attendants quickly realized his intentions and tried to stop him. "You can't go in there. It's a restricted area." But James's gaze was firm, persuasive. "I'm an aerospace engineer. If I don't go in there, we won't have any chance," he said in a deep, confident voice. The attendants hesitated, but eventually they allowed him into the cockpit. As the cockpit door opened, James was overwhelmed by the scene in front of him. The captain and the first officer were both unconscious, unresponsive. The control system on the dashboard was flashing with alarms. Red warning lights were flashing brightly, accompanied by the noise from the engine and the continuous warning alerts. James couldn't believe his eyes. Everything was quickly spiraling out of control. But there was no time to hesitate. James quickly sat down in the co-pilot's seat and began checking the indicators on the dashboard. He realized that the plane was losing altitude. Panic began to rise in him, but he took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. This was the moment he had to act. Although he wasn't a pilot, with the aviation knowledge he had, James started adjusting the basic settings on the dashboard while activating the emergency communication system with air traffic control. "This is Flight 204. We are experiencing a serious malfunction. We need immediate assistance." James's voice came through the communication system, but he quickly received a response from air traffic control. "Flight 204, we have received your signal. Please stay calm. We will guide you on how to control the situation." James began to follow the step-by-step instructions from air traffic control. The tension and fatigue kept rising, but he knew he had to continue. The lives of all the passengers depended on the decisions he made in these critical moments. The entire cabin of the plane was shaking violently. James's head spun with the sound of the engine screaming, the breaking noises of items colliding in the cabin, and the continuous alarm sounds blaring from the aircraft's systems. Time seemed to drag on slowly, every second taut with tension, yet it passed in a sense of desperation. In the cockpit, the only people left were James, an aerospace engineer with no experience flying a large aircraft like the Boeing 737 in a plane in danger. Both the captain and the first officer were unconscious, offering no support, and the entire flight was now in his hands. The voice of air traffic control came over the emergency communication system, cutting through the chaos in the cockpit. "Flight 204, this is Honolulu Control. We have received your signal. Stay calm. We will guide you on how to restore control." The voice was steady and composed, but inside James, the fear kept escalating. How could an aerospace engineer like him resolve such a complex situation without the help of professional pilots? He glanced at the control panel, the red warning lights glaring brightly, signaling severe system malfunctions. The plane was losing altitude, and the descent was accelerating. In just a few minutes, the plane would no longer be able to maintain its stability. He knew every second was a life-or-death opportunity for all the passengers on board. "James, we need you to keep the plane at a stable altitude. We will guide you on how to adjust." The voice from air traffic control came through his earpiece, giving him a flicker of hope. But could he do it? Did he have the courage to make the right decisions when everyone's lives depended on his actions? James's mind felt like it was about to explode from the stress, but he didn't give up. His mother's image flashed in his mind, her words of resilience and belief in himself. He remembered sitting beside her at night when she would tell him that nothing was impossible if he persevered and believed in himself. She always told him that no matter how the world treated him, he had to fight, stand tall. And now no one but James could save this flight. He had no time to hesitate. James gripped the control yoke tightly, feeling the powerful shakes from below. He couldn't just sit there waiting for a miracle. What he could do, he had to do now. This decision wasn't a choice. It was a responsibility. James took a deep breath, trying to calm the emotional waves rising within him. Air traffic control continued to broadcast detailed instructions. James, now you need to reduce speed, release the yoke, and keep the plane's pitch stable. Don't worry, we are here to help. He couldn't deny that he felt lost, his hands drenched in sweat, but his resolve was stronger than ever. Although not a pilot, James had thousands of hours learning about aircraft structure and their operating principles. He knew that if he persisted and maintained his composure, he would find a way to regain control. The seconds dragged on endlessly. The plane's altitude dropped significantly, and the shaking grew more intense. The control panel beeped continuously, the red warning lights casting a harsh glow over the cockpit. But no matter how many alarms blared, no matter how many red lights flashed, James had no choice but to follow the instructions. Every adjustment, every slight change on the control panel, he monitored the indicators, striving to keep the plane steady. A strange feeling rose within him, a feeling of responsibility, but also a sense of trust in himself. Every second, every action felt like a decision between life and death for all the passengers on board. "All right, James, you're doing great," air traffic control's voice came through the earpiece, giving him some motivation. "Now gently pull the plane up and stabilize. We'll begin the descent once you have the situation under control." He followed the instructions, and the Boeing 737 began to show signs of stabilization. Though still shaky, at least it was no longer out of control. The plane slowly stopped its freefall, but still required further adjustments. Each adjustment James made felt like he was standing on the edge between life and death. He knew there was no time to waste, and a single mistake could lead to irreversible consequences. The growl of the engines continued to echo, but this time James felt like he could control them. He wasn't feeling complacent, but at least in this moment, he had managed to take command of the situation. And as the plane began to stabilize, a part of him felt a sense of relief, though there was still a long way to go. But James didn't allow himself to stop. "Thank God," he thought, "but the job's not done." He continued adjusting, doing whatever was necessary to bring the plane safely to its destination. Every passing second made him feel closer to what he wanted, saving all the passengers and the peace he had longed for. Amidst the blaring alarms and chaos, James Carter felt like a stranger lost in a vivid nightmare. Yet this nightmare wasn't just about the loss of control of the aircraft, but the immense responsibility he had to bear. He realized that this was no simple moment for anyone. It was a life or death decision, one that could not wait. Every second that passed threatened the lives of those around him, and James was the only one who could change the outcome. The roar of the engines and the announcements from the aircraft's electronic systems continuously echoed through the cockpit, making the atmosphere even more tense. However, James knew he couldn't let panic distract him. The feeling of isolation when he saw both pilots unconscious, motionless in their seats, seemed to amplify the fear that hung over him. He looked at the control panel, the bright red warning lights, the blinking numbers signaling that the situation was critical. His mind raced, but his hands remained steady, his right hand gripping the yoke, his left moving quickly to restore the necessary indicators. Yet deep down, one big question rose in his mind. Am I really capable of this? This wasn't the first time James had faced self-doubt. Thousands of times throughout his career, he had been underestimated, disrespected by those who didn't recognize him simply because of his skin color. He had fought to prove himself in a workplace filled with racial and gender discrimination. Every time he faced hardship, he reminded himself that nothing was impossible as long as he didn't give up. And now he had to prove it once again, that he wasn't just a black man in aviation, but someone talented enough to save dozens of lives. The pressure was indescribable, but he continued to do what needed to be done, entering the cockpit with the determination to save the plane. He looked around and there was no one to help. Under the guidance of air traffic control, James managed to adjust the plane's pitch and stabilize its altitude. However, he knew that this wasn't the end. There was an even more important task: getting the plane to safety. He looked back at the control panel, his eyes fixated, feeling as though everything was working against him. But a spark of clarity emerged in his mind. The hours spent learning in the briefing rooms, the grueling training in aviation techniques, all of those moments had now helped him not only perform his job, but also save others. It was in those moments, as an engineer, that he had prepared himself for a situation like this, where nothing but knowledge and determination could help him prevail. James seized the opportunity when he heard the familiar voice of air traffic control through his earpiece. "James, we've assessed the situation. You need to stay calm and adjust the plane to a stable altitude. Remember, the key is to maintain the pitch and slowly regain speed." The guidance from air traffic control helped James gradually stabilize the plane, but he knew he couldn't celebrate just yet. Although things were starting to stabilize, he still had to adjust many things, and there was one crucial part left: the landing. The plane was still in the air, and he didn't have enough time to resolve all the issues. As the plane slowly stabilized, he began to feel the overwhelming fatigue. Both his body and mind were exhausted, but he didn't allow himself to rest. The passengers were still waiting for him, and he couldn't let them down. A few seconds from now, when the plane was ready to land, he knew it would be the moment that decided everything. The voice from air traffic control echoed again. "James, prepare for landing. You need to keep the plane stable and follow the next instructions for a safe landing. Remember, you've done very well. Just one more step." Although he wasn't a pilot, in that moment, James felt like part of the flight crew. He had to overcome not just technical challenges, but also a personal battle, a fight to not succumb to the pressure. He took a deep breath, regained his focus, and looked at the control screen. Every button, every parameter, every necessary indicator. Every action, every decision he made now would not only determine his survival, but the survival of everyone on board. James exhaled deeply, gently adjusting the plane's direction, preparing it for landing. He closed his eyes for a moment to regain focus, then opened them again to look at the sky ahead. This was not the time to stop. He would finish this, no matter the difficulty, and even though no one knew, even though no one witnessed, James would be the one standing strong, not just because he was an engineer, but because he had an unshakable determination that nothing could change, that nothing could. Time seemed to slow down, each second dragging out heavy and burdensome. The feeling of tension and panic began to fade, making way for the clarity that James had to find within himself. The plane, although somewhat stabilized under his control, was still far from fully restored. The heavy feeling still surrounded him, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. There was too much left to do, and even the smallest mistake could cause everything to fall apart. The voice of air traffic control came through again, gentle yet firm. "James, you've done very well. We need you to prepare for landing. Can you hear me?" "Loud and clear." James's voice was hoarse, fatigued but determined. The control panel still blinked with warnings, and the continuous sound of alarms made the atmosphere in the cockpit even heavier. Although the plane was stable, he couldn't shake the worry about landing. The plane was flying at a lower altitude than is safe, and he still had to adjust many things, from speed to angle, to avoid the point of no return. James gripped the yoke tightly, his eyes not leaving the control panel. In his mind, every next step had to be calculated carefully. He could feel a deep exhaustion, but the determination inside him still burned brightly. He couldn't back down, couldn't give up. If I can't do it, no one can, he reminded himself. Keeping the plane at altitude wasn't easy. Although the automatic system had been disconnected, the plane was still not fully stable. The engines weren't the only issue. The disorienting motion, the constant vibrations, even the slight imbalance of the aircraft meant he had to adjust everything bit by bit. Air traffic control continued to guide him. Now keep up the speed and continue checking the indicators. You need to descend slowly to avoid unwanted situations when entering the landing zone. Each command from air traffic control rang like golden instructions in this dangerous moment. James listened, following each step meticulously, but he knew he couldn't slow down time. Every second, every moment could be the final opportunity to make the right call. He tried to adjust the auto system to slowly reduce speed, but everything seemed not enough. A part of him began to worry about something beyond his control, the accuracy in reducing altitude. If it was too fast, the plane could lose balance. If it was too slow, landing would be dangerous. James didn't have much time. He remembered the training, the hours spent learning how to land safely, but he had never faced such a dangerous situation before. As the plane began to descend, the shaking intensified. The engines roared, coupled with the turbulence that made James even more anxious. He knew he was doing the right thing, but with every passing second, the feeling of uncertainty crept in, wondering if he could land successfully. A thought flashed through his mind. Can I do this? In that split second, he shook his head, dismissing all doubts. There was no room for hesitation now. He had to focus entirely on what he could control. Though uneasy inside, James took a deep breath, recentered himself, and continued to check the indicators, adjusting the systems. Stay calm, James, he told himself. You've done great. Don't lose focus. Every decision now is a crucial step. With each slight adjustment of the yoke, he felt himself slowly gaining control of the situation. The altitude dropped gradually, and the plane began to stabilize more. The tension didn't dissipate entirely, but at least the situation wasn't as dire as before. His hands began to feel numb, and his body ached, but there was no room for weariness in his heart. The passengers below still needed him, and they were hoping for his capability. A few more minutes passed. Finally, he saw a runway in the distance, a point of light in the dark, slowly drawing closer. He steered the plane toward it. A strange feeling like a gentle breeze passed through his mind. He couldn't stop until the plane was safely on the ground. The announcement from air traffic control came through. James, you've done very well. We're preparing a smooth landing for you. Keep up the speed and prepare. A moment of stillness passed, and then the sound of the engines began to fade. James knew he had succeeded in keeping the plane stable. Now was the final decision. Landing. He felt as if he had won the biggest battle of his life. Everything seemed to come together in this moment, and it was the final step. Just a little longer. The next few minutes passed in silence, but the anxiety and tension still lingered like a heavy fog. Though the plane had stabilized, James couldn't shake the feeling that he couldn't let his guard down. Had he ever imagined he would face such a crisis? Number. But now all he could do was continue, refusing to let fatigue or fear take over. His eyes focused on the control panel, where every number and indicator reflected the state of the aircraft. Not only had the warnings dimmed, but now it was time to make precise decisions. Every step, every small action. Landing with no room for error. No missteps allowed, no wrong decisions. The voice from air traffic control came through, this time gentler, but still filled with authority. James, you're doing great. We've prepared the landing strip for you. You need to reduce speed and maintain stable altitude. Don't rush. Everything will be fine. The anxiety within him didn't ease. Even though he had stabilized the plane, landing remained the greatest challenge. It was one of the skills that no amount of theory or experience could prepare him for in such an emergency situation. The red lights from the warning alarms still blinked relentlessly on the control panel. James didn't allow himself to lose focus. His single goal now was to bring the plane safely to its destination. The feeling of tightness filled James as he looked out at the scenery below. The runway wasn't far, but the plane still needed to reduce speed and maintain balance. Each passing second felt like a challenge, and he knew it was time to draw on all the knowledge he had learned, all the training hours he had dedicated to himself. The numbers, the indicators, all of it running through his mind like a high-speed film reel. The autopilot was gone. Now it was up to him to control everything manually. But in that moment, James felt like all his senses were more alert than ever. Despite the pressure, the calmness helped him maintain control of the situation. He gently adjusted the yoke to slowly reduce the plane's speed, not too hastily but not too slowly either. Every movement had to be precise, no mistakes allowed, no deviation. The tension from his body, the exhaustion from his aching hands. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't stop because the lives of everyone on board depended on each decision he made. In those moments, James felt like a tightrope walker with no safety net below. Everything was happening so fast that he could barely process it all. But the only thing he could do was continue, because if he didn't, everything could collapse in an instant. With each adjustment, he could feel the changes in the plane, the gentle shifts, the changes in the engine, and altitude no longer felt dangerous. The plane was slowly stabilizing, speed decreasing, altitude adjusting properly. James could feel the calm gradually settling in the air. He knew he was getting close to a safe landing. Just a little more, James thought to himself, as the voice of air traffic control brought him a glimmer of hope. "You're doing great, James. We'll guide you through the final step." At that moment, his heart raced, but a part of him knew he couldn't let anxiety control him. He took a deep breath and made the final adjustments needed to guide the plane to the runway. Each second was a challenge, but James would not allow himself to fail. He steadily controlled the plane, gradually lowering the altitude, keeping the aircraft stable in the air. Like a miracle, as the plane neared the ground, it glided through the air, descending slowly, touching down, and the wheels made contact with the runway with a strong thud, sending a slight jolt through the cabin. A bang echoed, and James felt the plane stop after a long, difficult journey. Applause started to fill the cabin. They all knew they were safe. James couldn't immediately breathe a sigh of relief, but inside there was a strange sense of peace. He had done it. He had saved them all. The plane had landed safely. That feeling was indescribable. An immense relief surged through James's body as the Boeing 737 finally touched down firmly. The wheels hit the ground with a strong thud, but not too unexpectedly. The plane slowed down, skimming along the runway, hastily covering its length. The dark clouds began to dissipate, and the sky cleared once again, though with a few scattered clouds. Inside the cabin, a wave of sighs of relief spread across. Passengers, from those who had been silent in fear to those who began crying in joy, all realized they had survived. They all knew a miracle had happened, and they would never forget the moment when a young man, a brave and resilient young man, had saved their lives. But for James, the feeling of triumph didn't come in waves as one might expect. Despite having accomplished the impossible and saving all the passengers, he didn't feel like a hero. Inside the cockpit, as he stopped controlling the plane and it came to a complete stop, only silence enveloped him. He lowered his head, his hands still tightly gripping the yoke. His body was exhausted, but his mind still raced. Everything felt as if it had just happened, and he hadn't had the chance to process everything around him. The light in the cockpit dimmed as the cockpit door opened. A flight attendant entered with an emotional face, but James couldn't face her. He didn't want to see admiration in their eyes, didn't want to hear words of thanks. He just wanted to return to the peace he was accustomed to, a quiet without the spotlight. "Great job, James," the flight attendant's voice sounded gently, but with a slight tremor. "You saved all of us." She gently patted his shoulder, but he didn't respond. He didn't feel like a hero. He was just someone doing his duty, someone who did what he could to save others. And now he just wanted to find peace for himself. James stepped out of the cockpit. For the first time, he walked past the passenger area without receiving looks of disdain, but with thanks and admiration from those he had saved. But he didn't stop. Not because he didn't want praise, but because in this moment he didn't want the glory. He just wanted quiet, just wanted to return to his life as if nothing had happened. When the plane finally stopped and the door opened, applause began to erupt. Not cheerful applause, not joyful applause, but applause filled with gratitude. James felt a lump in his throat. He turned back to look at the passengers, but didn't linger long. He just wanted to walk away, leave everything behind. In his heart, all the thanks, all the admiring looks, were things he didn't seek. As he walked down the plane's stairs, he felt the peace of the fresh airport air. James knew he had completed a monumental task, but the truth was, he didn't find joy in this victory. Instead, within him was an unusual stillness. He felt the fatigue deep within his body, but his spirit was not weighed down. He had done what he had to do, and that made him feel enough. A group of rescue workers from the airport quickly approached, and a brief encounter between them and James took place. However, James didn't allow himself to become too immersed in that meeting. He only responded to necessary questions and requested some rest. Not because he didn't want to talk, but because he was simply too tired. He didn't need attention. He didn't need to recount his story. Everything had happened, and now it was time for him to be silent. But when a police officer came closer, looked at him with a deep gaze and gently said, "You saved all of us, James. Nothing compares to that." Those words made James stop and look into the officer's eyes. There was no admiration, no glamour, only understanding, the appreciation that James needed at that moment. "We will never forget you." The officer said another sentence, then walked away. Those words felt like a gentle comfort, a confirmation that he had done the right thing. James stood there looking around, seeing everyone rejoicing, but he remained just a quiet man. He didn't need the glory, didn't need praise. He just needed peace. And although everything had ended, a part of him knew that, despite the lack of noise or the lights of fame, he had done the most important thing. He had saved the lives of people he didn't even know. The hours after the plane had landed, when everything had returned to normal, James still couldn't shake off the fatigue, even though his body had rested. Everyone around him had returned to their daily lives, but for James, that wasn't possible. He was still walking in another world, a world where he couldn't escape the mixed emotions and profound change he had just experienced. He left the airport after completing all the necessary procedures, but not because of a sense of happiness or pride in his actions. Although he had saved all the passengers, James felt a void inside, a loneliness that he couldn't put into words. It wasn't because he didn't feel satisfied with what he had done, but because throughout this journey, he had faced himself in ways he had never imagined. The strange feeling wasn't physical exhaustion or anxiety about the events that had occurred. It was the awareness that his life had changed forever. He had done the unimaginable with determination and intense focus, but now he was starting to realize that he had pushed past limits he once thought he couldn't overcome. And for him, that wasn't a victory, but a discovery. James walked through the busy streets, but everything around him seemed to not really exist. Every sound, every image became blurry. He no longer felt the joy or relief that others might find in a normal day. His only feeling now was one of profound quiet, as if he was standing before a new door in his life. What can I do next? This question echoed in his mind like a never-ending loop. Although he had completed his mission, James couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty and vagueness about the future. He thought about his old colleagues, those who had once underestimated his abilities just because of his skin color. Would they see him differently after this event? Could he change the way they viewed him? Or would he always remain someone who had to accept the lack of recognition in his field? He also thought about his mother, who had always encouraged him, teaching him how to live with resilience. Had she ever felt the way he did now? Would she be proud of him? But these thoughts didn't help him solve anything. They just left him more confused, deepening the sense of being lost in his own life. Yet a part of him still felt the change. He had done the impossible, faced the greatest challenge of his life, and overcome it. Although it wasn't outwardly visible, James knew that, in those moments of intense pressure, he had truly discovered a powerful part of himself that he had never noticed before. It wasn't glory, but maturity, something he had never anticipated. James stopped at a small park, the place he often visited when he needed time to think. He sat on an old bench, his eyes gazing toward the distant setting sun. A strange sense of peace flooded him. Despite all the unanswered questions, he understood that he was no longer the person he once was. He hadn't just saved others, but he had saved himself from fear, self-doubt, and hesitation. Everyone thought he was a hero, but James knew he wasn't. He was just an ordinary man, someone who faced difficulties and found a way to overcome them. He didn't need anyone's recognition because he had proven the most important thing to himself. Resilience, courage, and inner strength are what truly matter. Without the spotlight or thunderous applause, James felt a profound change within himself. He wasn't the man who saved the plane. He was the man who saved a part of his own life, and that was the greatest victory he could achieve. He didn't need to have all the answers immediately. Each day would bring new challenges, and he would continue walking the path he had chosen, not for the recognition of the world, but for himself, for what he believes in, and for the faith he had rediscovered within himself. As darkness gradually fell, James stood up, deciding to return home. Today might be an ordinary day for many, but for him it was a day of discovery. He had come to understand that life isn't about external successes or failures. It's about the quiet steps you take, the decisions you make without needing anyone to acknowledge them. And no matter what, he would keep going, stronger and more resolute. The next day, as the light of dawn streamed through the window, James woke up in an unusually quiet space. His eyes were slightly darkened from exhaustion, but his mind was clearer than ever. The fatigue had passed, but the thoughts of everything that had happened still swirled in his head. He knew he had changed, not just physically, but in his soul and spirit. Yesterday, he had saved everyone on the plane. He had overcome the greatest challenge of his life, but now, after everything had settled down, he no longer felt like a hero. He was just an ordinary person who had weathered a storm, who had stood firm to reflect on himself and his life. As he stood in front of the mirror in the morning, James saw a man he had never recognized. That man was nothing special except for the marks of maturity, lines on his forehead from thinking, a spark in his eyes that reflected determination, and hands that never stopped moving as he held tightly to the memories of the past. But above all, in his gaze was freedom, a relief he had never felt before. He had fought not just to save others, but to save himself. James straightened up and walked out of the room, his feet steady like someone who no longer feared. Though there were still many unanswered questions, he knew he didn't need all the answers right now. A new path had opened up before him, and he would walk that path with all the strength within him. Because he knew that life isn't a race for glory, but a journey to find peace within oneself. The tension from before had dissolved. James no longer felt the need to prove anything. He didn't need recognition from anyone, nor did he need to chase success as society defined it. He had found his own worth, and that was enough to keep him moving forward. The lights and shadows of his life were behind him now, and it was time for him to write the next chapters of his own life. The scene outside the window changed little by little as he stepped out of the house. The bustling city remained the same, but in his heart was a completely different space. Cars rushed by, people hurriedly passed, but James no longer felt caught in that cycle. He noticed the small moments of life, the smiles of strangers, the clear laughter of children, untold stories from passers-by. All these things made him realize that life, despite its challenges, was full of little miracles he had never noticed. James no longer chased after anything. He no longer let external things define his worth. He understood that the most important thing was faith in himself. There had been times when he felt undeserving, when he thought no one truly saw him. But now he understood that self-confidence didn't come from others' recognition, but from seeing oneself in the right way, without regret. He walked down the new path, not because he was seeking something, but because he had found peace within himself. The challenges of the past were no longer burdens, but valuable lessons, unforgettable experiences that made him stronger for the road ahead. With steady steps, the sunlight shone on his hair, and in that moment, James knew he was ready for new things. The path ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he had learned that no matter what, as long as he kept faith in himself, he would always find a way to overcome every challenge. Though there were no more moments of glory, no more praise in his heart, that was the greatest victory. He had done something few could imagine. He had faced his greatest fear in life and walked out of it, not with a title, but with maturity and resilience. Life went on, and James was ready to embrace it all, not because he had to do something, but because he understood that with every step, he was discovering himself. James Carter's story, from saving all the passengers on the flight to his profound personal transformation, is a testament to the power of overcoming challenges. It is not just a story of courage, but also a journey of self-discovery in a society rife with racism and prejudice. As a black man, James faced many obstacles at work where racial discrimination forced him to work twice as hard as others. This not only made him feel oppressed, but also meant he had to constantly prove his abilities. However, during the difficult moments when the plane encountered trouble, James did not allow that discrimination to weaken his courage. He acted not for recognition, but because he knew he could do something right, and that was what mattered. Although James saved all the passengers, he did not see himself as a hero. Instead, he began to realize that true maturity does not come from seeking external glory, but from the decisions and actions that stem from self-belief. After enduring a harsh trial, James found peace within himself. He did not need the approval of others to feel valuable. Instead, he learned to evaluate and appreciate himself based on his actions and resilience, not by what society or others expected. This story is not just about saving others, but about saving oneself from the limitations that society and our own minds impose. James conquered his fears, his self-doubts, and most importantly, the boundaries he once set for himself. He understood that true strength does not come from the recognition of others, but from the ability to face challenges and overcome them with what we have inside. James's story is a reminder of the inner strength we all have, that sometimes we need to face the toughest challenges to discover our true power. Ultimately, James's story is a journey of self-awareness and self-acceptance. After everything that had happened, he no longer sought recognition or glory. He realized that the most important thing was inner peace, self-confidence, and resilience. He no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. He had learned to live for himself. This is also a powerful message about how we should not live for external validation, but for the integrity and value within us that each of us carries. James Carter's story is not only a life and death journey, but also a quest for freedom and inner peace. It is a testament to overcoming racism in life's hardships, as well as a confirmation that when we believe in ourselves, we can overcome any challenge. In the end, James not only saved others, but he also saved himself from the pressures of society and discrimination, finding a life full of freedom and peace.